So hello everyone and welcome to yet another PTC Nordic Talks webinar where we are excited today by having Darrsan, who is CAD engineer at PTC, for a session on Creo 9 core modeling for industrial enterprises. But first a really quick introduction about myself. My name is Torbjörn Peterson and I'm the Alliance Manager for PTC in the Nordics, and we are running these webinars on Fridays every week at the same time, where we are inviting customers and partners for some inspiration on digital transformation to see what is possible and how to make things happen. And all the past webinars have been recorded and are to be found on the registration site. And we are also doing an update on that, so it will be on YouTube as well in just a few days from now, I guess, and hope. And the agenda for today is first a quick overview of PTC by my colleague Carl from the customer success team, and then Darrsan will start by introducing himself, touch base on a few challenges, how to address these, and then explain some of the outcomes. And at the end, we're also having a Q&A session, so please keep your questions to the end. So now over to you, Carl.
Thank you, Torbjörn. So PTC is an international software company with headquarters based in Boston. We are developing software mainly for manufacturing companies since 1985. We offer tools for the digital transformation, such as CAD for design, PLM for managing data, IoT to connect products or manufacturing operations, and augmented reality to visualize and interact with the digital thread. To you, Darrsan.
Thank you very much, Carl and Torbjörn. Hi everyone, my name's Darrsan. I'm a CAD engineer here at PTC, and today's topic will be around core modeling for industrial enterprises, with a particular focus on our flagship product here at PTC, or the latest iteration of our flagship product with Creo 9. Now, when we think about core modeling has really been at the heart of parametric modeling since the early days back in the 1980s. So I think the improvements we've made to Creo 9 from a core modeling perspective will really benefit every single one of our users on a day-to-day basis. And with that, I'd like to show off some of the improvements we've made with Creo 9 so that you can utilize these improvements to improve your everyday workflow processes. So let's start off with one of the most exciting additions to Creo 9 from a core modeling perspective with this Divide Surfaces tool. Now, as you can probably tell from the name, the purpose of this tool is to separate a surface into different regions based on a sketch projection or a chain of curves. And this feature is supported by the surfaces of both solid bodies and quilts. And we've also got a new Unify Surfaces tool, which does the exact inverse of a Divide Surface tool. And this allows users to recombine already divided surfaces. And within this Unify Surfaces tool, we have an Update Surface References option. And this option can be enabled to ensure that any surface references that were subsequently created with any Divide Surface feature are preserved with this Unify Surface feature. Now, these features are something that our customers have been wanting, and the reason why there's such a high demand for this feature here is because of the expanded capability these features bring to Creo 9. And these expanded capabilities include things like geometric definition with model-based definition when you want to assign contact areas, PMI, manufacturing requirements, and so forth. It also streamlines the workflow for assigning aesthetics, so things like surface finishes, appearances, and textures, as well as process definition. And we also come into simulation and generative design, as with Divide Surfaces and Unify Surfaces, it's much easier to now apply loads and constraints on individual defined areas. And it also streamlines the workflow to create things like engravings using our flexible modeling capabilities in Creo 9. So I'm going to jump into a live demonstration here. So I've got this part here, which is actually from the Seat Cooper car model dataset. And this part here, to be specific, is from the rear suspension of that car. And what I'm going to do is, in order to access this new Divide Surface tool, I need to go into my Split drop-down menu, and you can see there's Divide Surface. And once I enable Divide Surface, you can see I'm presented with this environment where it's asking me, do I want to use a sketch or a chain of curves? In this case, I'm going to create my own sketch, so I'll keep that option as is. So it's asking me what surface do I want to divide. I'll select this surface here, and I'm going to create a sketch in this case. So I'll just create a sketch using this plane here as a reference. And let's just say in this case, I'm just going to separate this part using this line here. So a very simple divide surface function here, but you can immediately see this divide surface in action as I've separated that surface into two different regions. And once I've completed that feature, you can see that, okay, I'll just turn off my datum planes here. So you can see that this surface region has a surface ID of F92, and this surface region has that old surface ID of F9. And I can actually switch these references around if I go back into my divide surface tool, and if I enable flip divided side, we can see that now I can switch those references around so that this surface region on this side now has that new surface ID of F92, and this surface region here has that original surface ID of F9. But in this case, I'll just go back to what I had before. And as I mentioned, we can also use predefined sketches to perform our divide surface operation. So here I've created a sketch here, and this is just simple Creo text sketch here. And what I'm going to do is, whilst I have this sketch selected, I'm once again going to use divide surface, but this time you can see it's already used a predefined sketch. And once again, I'll just select a surface to divide. In this case, I'll select that newly created surface region. And just like that, you can see I've separated this surface region into a new region with its own unique surface ID of F93. And it's these unique surface ID references that allow us to perform expanded capability in Creo 9. So I mentioned one of those areas was Creo Simulation Live and generative design, as I can now assign fixed constraints and loads on defined areas just like that. I also mentioned model-based definition was also another one of those areas. So I'll just change the orientation here. So I'll just select that annotation plane. And what I can do now is I can assign things like geometric tolerances to an individual defined areas much easier than I could before. So I also mentioned it's much easier to now create things like engravings and extrusions. So what I can do now is, in my flexible modeling tab, I can select I want to move a surface region, and I'm going to select this surface region for this Creo text sketch. And what I can do now is I can create an engraving very quickly, just like that. You can see I've got that engraving of Creo in this part. Now, in order to access our Unify Surfaces tool, what I need to do is it's located in our editing tab below the split drop-down menu. And what my target surface here is going to be is I'm going to select this as my target surface, and the surface I'm going to unify will be this surface region here. And you can see that what I'm doing here is I'm recombining that divided surface region back into that original surface region I had. And what I should see here is that original surface ID reference of F92. In fact, this is the opposite way around. So this is the new surface ID reference I generated. So in order to go back to my original surface ID reference, I'm just going to switch these two around. So my target surface will be this surface region here, and my surface to unify will be this surface region. And now we can see that I've preserved that original surface ID reference of F9. So that's divide and unify surfaces in Creo 9. Again, pretty simple to understand tools, but I think they'll actually bring a lot of extra capability in Creo 9. So the next area I wanted to talk about from a core modeling perspective is our Sketcher working environment. If you think about the Sketcher working environment, it's probably one of the most used environments in the CAD modeling with Creo for any sort of engineer or any user. And that's why I think the improvements that we've made here from a Sketcher working capability, these improvements will be recognized and seen by people using this on a day-to-day basis. So we'll start off with the first improvement, which is something called Autoscale Sketch. Now, something we recognize from hearing feedback from our customers is that they would initially start off by creating a sketch with random dimensions. So these dimensions wouldn't necessarily be accurate with the actual dimensions they wanted to achieve, but this sketch would retain the rough geometry that they were trying to achieve. So what would happen in Creo 8 and prior versions is that when they would start to make modifications to these dimensions, they would see that the sketch would go all haywire and the aspect ratio would be completely changed as a result of this change. So what would happen is that the geometry they had initially with these sketches would not be preserved. That's no longer the case with Creo 9 thanks to this tool called Autoscale Sketch, as Autoscale Sketch now automatically adjusts the entire dimension palette that you have based on the change you make to any sort of initial dimension. This will make more sense as I jump into a demonstration right here. So what I'll do here is I'll just demonstrate the workflow of most of our users here in Creo. So I'll start off with a new part environment here, and I'll start off by creating a new sketch. So this is what would happen. So our users would start off by creating some sort of sketch here. I'm just going to create a random sketch here. And this sketch here would, whilst it would represent the rough geometry that our users would try to achieve, the dimensions associated with this sketch would usually be random. So these aren't the accurate dimensions that our users would try to achieve. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a modification to one of these initial dimensions. So let's say I'm going to modify this 147.24 dimension to something like 500 millimeters. So let's say 500 millimeters is the accurate dimension we're trying to achieve. So what would happen in Creo 8 and prior versions is that this geometry that I'm looking at here would not be preserved because the aspect ratio would go all haywire, because when I make a change to this dimension would end up being much, much larger or much, much smaller than all of these dimensions. But in Creo 9, let's take a look at what happens. So I'm going to change this from around 147 millimeters to 500 millimeters. But you can see in Creo 9, the geometry that I'm looking at has not changed and the aspect ratio is completely fine. So let's take a look at why that is. So I'm going to undo that change and let's pay close attention to all of these dimensions and let's take a look at what happens. So once again, I'll change this to 500 millimeters and you can see that all of these corresponding dimensions here have automatically scaled up by the exact amount that I've scaled this initial dimension by, allowing us to preserve this workflow, allowing us to preserve the geometry of this sketch. So that's Autoscale Sketch in Creo 9. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to move on to our next improvement in our Sketcher working environment, which is some new, modernized and more intuitive user interfaces for our project and offset tools. So our project and offset tools are probably one of our most commonly used tools by our users, as it allows users to essentially bring in some references from any sort of geometry into the Sketcher working environment. And before we had a bullet point system for our user interface, but now we've made changes to this user interface, which will allow our users to collect references and also manage these references much, much easier than before. So once again, this will make more sense once I jump into a demonstration. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use this sketch that I just created. I'm going to extrude this to create a new body. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create another sketch on the face of this body here. And in this case, I'll demonstrate the project tool, but the improvements we've made to the project and offset tools are pretty much identical. So this time I'll use the project tool and you can immediately see I've got this much cleaner and more intuitive user interface than the old bullet point system I had in Creo 8 and prior versions. So in order to select references, it's literally as simple as clicking and selecting your edges to get a one-by-one selection. If I want to select multiple references, I just hold Control and I select these edges. If I want to get a chain selection of these references, I just hold Shift and I hover my cursor over a corresponding edge to get a chain selection. And finally, if I want to get a surface loop selection of references, I just hold Shift, hover my cursor over the cross-sectional area of this body, and I get a surface loop selection. So much easier to collect and manage references for both our project and offset tools in Creo 9. So I'll just exit out of this. And the final improvement that I want to talk about today from a sketcher work capability is some enhanced and enriched inspection tools in Creo 9, as we now have the ability to better highlight any sort of overlapping geometry. Now, this is something I've experienced a lot from working with various customers here at PTC. Customers would often create very complex sketches, and they would find that these sketches would be incomplete, which means that they cannot reference that sketch or use that sketch in any sort of geometry creation feature like an extrude or revolve. And before in Creo 8, it would be quite hard to identify this overlapping geometry, but in Creo 9, it is very simple. So I'll just jump back to the part that I just created. So let's say I'll take a look at this sketch here. This sketch isn't particularly complex, but in this case, I'll just add some sort of overlapping geometry. So let's say that I've got a bit of overlapping geometry here. So I'm just going to add another line, and this can happen very easily when working with complex sketches. And you can see that this sketch is now incomplete because I don't have this cross-sectional area being highlighted by that pinkish sort of shaded hue. So now I cannot reference this sketch for any sort of geometry creation feature like this extrude. Before, what I'd have to do is go back to the sketch, and I would have to essentially split the sketch in half and carry out an iterative process to roughly narrow down which rough area this overlapping geometry lies in. But now it's literally as simple as going into our inspection tools in Creo 9 and saying I want to highlight any overlaps in this sketch. So if I enable this, you can immediately see that the overlapping geometry is highlighted in red, and I can just simply delete this overlapping geometry, and now my sketch is complete. So those are the improvements that I wanted to talk about from a sketcher capability. Now I want to move on to some enhancements we've made to our pattern feature. So a pattern feature is something that we introduced it some time ago, and it's one of the most commonly used core modeling features by our customers, as it enables much faster regeneration times when we want to reference a feature like a hole, for instance, and create multiple instances of those holes. We have something called a geometry pattern, and that's where the improvement in Creo 9 lies in. So now we have something called an identical regeneration option for a geometry pattern. We had this option for regular pattern feature, but a lot of our users wanted to see this for a geometry pattern feature, as a geometry pattern feature allows us to preserve any sort of feature we're patterning, as it creates a copy geometry of that feature, and then we can reference that feature again thanks to a geometry pattern feature. And because we're bringing in this identical regeneration option for geometry pattern, we are seeing much faster regeneration times in Creo 9 for this feature. So what better way to demonstrate this than a live demonstration? So I've got this fan cover here, which I've just created, a very simple fan cover. And you can see I've already created a hole feature here. So I'll just get rid of these planes for us. There we go. So I've created this whole feature, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a geometry pattern of that hole. And you can see in my model tree, a geometry pattern is creating a copy geometry of that hole feature. So it's not directly referencing that hole feature, which means we can repattern that hole feature again, even after we carry out this geometry pattern feature here. So I'm going to go for a fill pattern, select sketch 2. Let's give it a border of around 3 millimeters here. And we can see that this is what we had before. So we had both a general and variable regeneration option, but this identical regeneration option was actually grayed out before because it wasn't available. And let's see how long a general regeneration option takes with a geometry pattern feature. So with a general regeneration option, Creo is having to calculate the instances of all of these features individually. So it's a lot of calculation work for Creo to do, hence why the regeneration can take a while. So I'm just going to cancel out of this feature here. So let's just stop this right here. And I'm just going to redefine this feature here. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch this regeneration option to an identical regeneration option, which is new to Creo 9. And what this allows us to do is we will see much faster regeneration times, because with this identical regeneration option, Creo makes an assumption that the geometry of all of these instances highlighted by these yellow circles are identical to one another. It also makes the assumption that this geometry of these instances cannot overlap one another, and these instances must be spread out across an identical surface. So it makes several assumptions with this identical regeneration option, hence why we will see much faster regeneration times. So let's take a look at how much faster this identical regeneration option is in Creo 9. Don't blink because you might miss it. And you can see we've just removed a ton of geometry in literally a second. I think this feature is quite frankly incredible. When I first saw this, I was amazed, and I know when I demonstrated this to a lot of customers, they were immediately like, wow, that is extremely quick. So the final improvement I wanted to talk about today before I leave it, I pass it on to questions, is some enhanced flexibility with our pattern features as well. So before, whenever we wanted to change the hole type between a simple and a standard hole type, we would have to get rid of that entire pattern feature and then change the type of hole. But now in Creo 9, we don't have to do that. We can change the type of hole directly within a pattern feature. So let's see if I can demonstrate this here. So you can see in this copy geometry feature, what I'd have to do before is I would have to get rid of this pattern and then change the type of hole. But now what I can do is I can change the type of hole directly within the hole feature, even if that hole feature is being referenced inside a corresponding pattern feature. So those are the improvements that I wanted to talk about from a core modeling perspective in Creo 9. Again, these are something that all of our industrial enterprises and our customers and users, these improvements are something that all of them will see on a day-to-day basis. And I think this really will just make the work process in Creo much easier for our customers and users. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions on what I covered?
Thanks a lot, Darrsan, for sharing all your interesting insights and demos to start with. And as you said, I mean, let's open up for any questions you might have in the audience.
Thanks to everyone.
Anyone who would like to go first? Otherwise, I have one first question. Actually, I was quite curious about. I mean, to know a little bit more about. I mean, what about the update process? I mean, from previous versions of Creo to Creo 9. How? I mean, are there any kind of specific steps you need to take and any kind of preparations you need to do? And could you elaborate a little bit on that?
So when a lot of customers make that transition from something like, let's say, Creo 7 to Creo 9, the update process isn't as complex as a lot of customers might initially think of. The update process usually involves just updating your license, so you'll immediately be given a new license file, and you can immediately just use the install configuration window to reconfigure your licenses, and then your Creo 9 update will automatically pop up. You just have to reinstall your existing Creo installation, and immediately Creo 9 will be updated. Sorry, your existing installation of Creo will immediately be updated to Creo 9, and you will immediately have access to all of these features that I just showed here. Some of the features that I might show off later in some more in-depth sessions like generative design obviously depend on any extensions you might have. But again, because all of these extensions are seamlessly integrated into Creo, the update process is extremely convenient for our customers, as it's not something that takes a lot of time or resources to perform.
Right, thanks.
Sure.
Anyone else in the audience having any specific questions? Please go ahead. I have one additional question if no one else is having one, and that is also related a little bit, I mean, to who do you think, I mean, should normally, I mean, get involved, I mean, to any kind of, I mean, successful, I mean, CAD implementation product?
I think in terms of who should get involved, I think it comes down to the engineers of these companies, the people who are actually using this product on a day-to-day basis. I think they are the ones who obviously understand the requirements of what they need in a CAD tool the best. And I think they should initially get involved with any sort of upgrade considerations a customer might have. That's my opinion. And having worked with a lot of these engineers from these customers, I think they've immediately been impressed with how much Creo 9 can really do from a capability perspective. And the process with actually upgrading, I'm going back to your previous question, it usually starts off with these engineers from our customers, and these engineers immediately get in touch with PTC, and they immediately request us to demonstrate what sort of features are new to Creo, so some of the features I showed today, and obviously they're the ones who decide if these features correlate to what they want with their product portfolio.
Right, thanks. All right, do we have anyone else having any questions in the audience, or how does it look like? Crystal clear from your point, I guess, Darrsan.
Thank you very much.
So, many thanks everyone for joining this session, and of course a special thanks to you, Darrsan. So with that, I wish you a fantastic weekend and hope to see you next week on the next Nordic Talks webinar. Bye with that, take care.
Thank you everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Darrsan. Have a good weekend.